the many ceilings that probably were on your way um, to get there. So thank you so much for joining us today. And the association has about 600 members, and some of them will join us today, and then some of them will probably look at the recording of our conversation. Um, so my first question to you is, so you retired in 2016 as a CEO of a company. What was your journey to the C-suite? And while you were on that journey, were you thinking, okay, well, at some point, this will translate into a board career?
No, it's a great question. My career in healthcare really started at a very young age. I started working in hospitals when I was in high school and decided in college that I didn't have the stomach for medicine, which was my original plan, but decided to go into healthcare administration. And so actually when I finished college at Duke University, I actually took three different jobs trying to get clinical and operational experience in hospitals because I had no clinical background. And so I worked as a nurse aide in a small hospital in Florida. I did an internship in a small hospital in Lynchburg, Virginia. I worked at Duke Hospital. All these jobs paid me very little. I think I made $3.25 an hour. But it gave me great exposure. And in that process, I met some people that really were very supportive of my desire to go into healthcare leadership and wrote me, nice recommendations. I ended up going to Cornell University for my MBA, which I got in healthcare administration and accounting. I felt as a woman it was important to have strong financial skills because there were so few women running hospitals in those days. This is back in the late 70s that I knew I just had to have a skill set that would allow me to succeed and be able to go toe to toe with financially oriented people who typically serve on hospital boards. So then I did a fellowship in Chicago. Actually, I did an administrative residency in New York City at Sloan Kettering when I was at Cornell. And then I did a fellowship in Chicago with the American Hospital Association and Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, where I got exposed to an amazing array of real icons in the healthcare field. I met people like Wilbur Cohen, who started Medicare and Medicaid as the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the 60s. I met the original founder of Blue Cross Blue Shield, a gentleman in Texas who decided that they needed health care for the union employees and the workers in the state. It was just a fascinating experience. And at that time, I met my first real mentor, Gail Warden, who ended up recruiting me ultimately to work at the Henry Ford Health System. But I had a very interesting route between those two experiences. I worked in Akron, Ohio, where I grew up, and worked for an amazing mentor who basically brought me on as a head of operations for 6 departments in the hospital in 1980 when I was 25. And then I moved up into a strategic planning role 2 years later. And then 3 years later, I ended up being the chief operating officer in the middle of quite a financial crisis in healthcare in 1983. And at that time, I got exposed to the board. And I realized also that healthcare was very much a community-based resource, and it was important to become engaged in healthcare within the community and serve on boards, which I did from that moment on. And in fact, in my career, I've served on over 85 boards, mostly
Wow.
nonprofits. Yeah, mostly nonprofits. But now I think I've been on 6 public boards and a few private boards. And so it's been an extraordinary experience. My first actual public board was when I was 32 years old in Akron. And the chief operating officer of the local bank, which was First National Bank of Ohio, served on our board of Akron City Hospital. And he invited me to join the board, which I just found mind boggling at the time. I didn't even understand it. I didn't know anything about, public boards and certainly nothing about banking. But this gentleman saw something in me and asked me to join the board, which I did, and got an amazing exposure in a very short period of time. Then I went and ran a 1,000-bed hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I ran a region of 11 hospitals in 6 states for a large Catholic system, a national Catholic system. Went back to Akron, was going to succeed my mentor when he retired, and then got
Hi, Nancy.
sorry about that.
No worries. I'd always say that I was getting really interested. So then, because it seems like a very intentional career. So then I had a bunch of questions. I was like, I will never be able to ask those questions. Um, so there's a few things that strike me. One of the things is that you were very intentional in your career. You kind of knew what you wanted to do, and you took the steps to do it. Does that continue to drive you now in your board career? Meaning, do you still have objectives and you work toward those objectives, or at this point you're just following where the career takes you?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I think I've been intentional my whole life. I when my mother used to say that she quit raising me in the 8th grade because I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I decided where I wanted to go to school. I changed my major in college 3 times, and she never worried about that. She felt like I would figure it out. And it is true. My board career has also been intentional. I've decided very consciously the things that I was interested in, and I've turned down things along the way that didn't interest me. I've gotten off boards for different reasons over the course of my career, sometimes based on either ethical or just the competency of the board. Sometimes it was really about just my time and the interest in that particular board. Um, but I never do anything halfway. So, when I commit to something, and particularly board work, I'm all in. I want to do a good job and make sure that I'm contributing in a meaningful way. But one of the things I didn't mention that does relate to the fact that I'm a gay woman is that I got outed when I was running the 1,000-bed teaching hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And I actually wrote my book about this, called Unconventional Leadership, because I was outed. And then ultimately, a person on the board, a chair of the board, decided that I should never be promoted because I was gay. And so I ended up leaving.
Which year was that?
It was
Which
1997.
okay.
And I left that organization, much to the chagrin of really the employees, the doctors, my board at the time, my hospital board. But it's a fascinating story because the chairman of my board, which was the hospital board, part of a larger health system, he ended up coming back to visit me on 2 occasions after that to apologize for what he had not backed me up, and that he realized that my leaving really had a negative impact on the organization, and that I had created a culture that was very positive and something that really allowed the organization to thrive. And
I'm a little bit ashamed that I didn't know you had written a book.
yeah,
It does sound like an amazing story. So I heard that you went to Duke, and I kind of have this imagine of Duke as being a Southern university. I know you're on the board now, um, so I kind of imagine you probably evolved as a young lady in a rather conservative environment.
yeah, it was
Um,
very difficult actually. And I've told the folks at Duke that my Duke experience as a student was incredibly isolating. I discovered I was gay my really my sophomore year, and we just became very, closed off from everything because there was a lot of fear in the early 70s. And so yeah, it's funny, serving on the board now, it's like a totally new world compared to the world that I experienced there. And in fact, I worked at the Duke Hospital. Now I'm chairing the Duke Health System board. It's so ironic the way life goes.
Yeah, it does sound a little movie-like that
Yeah.
that you went to university there and experienced probably some level of homophobia, and now you're on the board. I would say that that kind of close the circle, or at least
Yeah, there's a lot of circles in my life, that's for sure.
um, so, d- given the fact that you kind of knew you wanted to be in leadership in healthcare, were you always a little concerned that maybe your sexual orientation would play a negative role in your career, or
Yeah.
that what happened in 97 could happen at some point?
I was always concerned. In fact, it was sort of, when it actually happened, it was my worst nightmare because I had been closeted in my career for about 15 years. And no one, basically had very, very, very few friends in the community. Very, very few people in my life. My parents didn't know. My siblings didn't know. And then when I was outed, I decided, what the heck, I'm going to tell everybody. And what was fascinating about it was how well it went and how it was turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me in my life. And I think probably for many of us, that final moment of coming out to people that you know and love and finding out they still love you. That doesn't always happen. I recognize that, but in my case, I was very fortunate. But the amount of emotional, how taxing it was for all those years. It's sometimes is even hard to talk about because you realize how buttoned up you have to be, to live in that world, and how unfortunate it is for any of us that can't be who we are. And so,
You
yeah,
know,
it
you know
was
what is
tough.
interesting that I told you there are about 28 people that are LGBT that are Fortune 500 board member, and a lot of them share the experience you described, right? Like, Jim Fitterling talks about how, he had this health issue and he felt that maybe it was related to the fact that he had been closeted all of his life and he decided to come out. But at that point, he's in his 50s. We know that Tim Cook, came out pretty late in life. And, Barry Diller just came out
Yeah,
in the New
right,
York
with this
Times
book. Yeah.
a few weeks ago. And so that's kind of interesting that in a way, it kind of asks the question of would you have gotten to that level in your career if you had been out from the beginning?
It's a question I'm not sure I could answer. I think I think in Akron, my boss, who I know the way he was, I don't think it would have been an issue for him, but I'm not sure about the board. It ended up the board was the group, particularly one person, but the board was the problem for me, not my leadership team, not my colleagues. Um, but
Well,
you
and, and,
just
and, that's kind of music to my ears because I do believe a little bit that sometimes the boardroom is a bit more conservative than society
yeah,
in general,
I
and
think it is much more conservative often.
there is good reason, right? Because they are steward of for shareholders, right? And they have to ensure that you know the the people they bring in are trustworthy. And but one of the things that I find fascinating is that it makes me think a little bit of the story of Jim Fitterling, who talks about taking the plane to go to see all the board members and to say, by the way, I'm LGBT, I'm LGBT. Is that going to be an issue? And it talks about that.
Well, let me tell you a quick story because Alan Gilmore, who you may know,
Oh, yeah, yeah, in Detroit.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, he was the CFO at Ford Motor, and he was the chair of the board at Henry Ford when I joined. And he had to go through the same thing because he was outed by Fortune magazine. And he was on a number of corporate boards at that time. I think he was on Prudential and Whirlpool and Ford Motor and, a bunch of boards. And he did the same thing that Jim did, going to each board member and saying, is this a problem? I'll get off the board. And for none of them, it was a problem because they knew him. I think the key with all of us is when people know who you are and they have served alongside you for a period of time, it becomes a non-issue because they know the competency, they know the quality of the individual. It just doesn't seem to be an issue. But I think that's why coming out becomes so important because then people know you, as who you are, and they begin to change their own views about our community because it's not necessarily what they thought. It's the people they begin to know very well. It's really been quite a lesson learned over the years for me.
Well, I have a question for you because we publish a report every year, and in one of the report one year we had a bit of an article about what are the barriers to LGBT people getting in the boardroom, and one of the things we identified, there were a few things, and to some extent actually prejudice, right? The idea that
Right.
if you break social norm, should you be trusted with fiduciary responsibility? But one of the things that seemed to be a big issue is the network. And my question to you would be, as a lesbian, did you feel sometimes that maybe your socialization was not with the people that mattered, or that, you know what I mean, that in a sense maybe you were not in the right golf club or not in the right country club, and that you were a bit at the margin of the ecosystem? Or did you feel that you were always in the ecosystem? And I'll ask you a second question. We had one of our board members that told us one day that she read the newspaper before each board meeting so that she would be up to date on sports and she could connect with the other board member. And have you ever felt that this is some of
Well,
the sense you have?
it's interesting. I think I've always sort of connected. I worked with all men in my career for the most part until, probably the last 10 to 15 years of my career. So I learned how to live in that world. It wasn't about being gay so much. It was as a woman. I learned to play golf when I was 25 because I wanted to fit in. And all my colleagues at Akron City Hospital played golf. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get to know these people if I don't play golf. We played public courses for the most part. It wasn't about the private club, but it was much more about connecting. And I've always liked sports. So, I could always go toe to toe about, the weekend baseball game or NCAA March Madness. I just enjoyed it myself. So that wasn't very hard. It was, and in fact, I never really felt that even when people knew I was gay, and I was far enough along in time, where things were a little different. But it was just it never became an issue for me. In fact, my wife was welcome to all the events, and she didn't often want to go. I mean, it wasn't her thing, but when she did, I mean, everyone was incredibly welcoming and gracious to her. And, it just didn't feel like much of an issue. Of course, I think for all of us, it's how we handle it. If it's not anything big, it's just normal life. And, this is my wife, this is my husband, whoever, I mean, I think it goes better is sort of my theory on it. And, and my network, frankly, was a bunch of men, because that's who I knew. And in fact, the way I got on the Walgreens board when in 2006 was someone I met in my fellowship at the American Hospital Association who became a search consultant. And he called me and said, Walgreens is looking for a healthcare person. And you were the first person that came to mind. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Thank you. Because I never really thought about being on a public board. I thought as a nonprofit healthcare leader, there's no way I'm going to be on a public board. It just never occurred to me. So it was such a surprise and a great surprise when I got called for that board. And then, ended up serving now for 19 years on that board.
I love it because it also reminds me a bit, the chair of our board is Betsy Bernard. I don't know if you know her.
I
And
know of her. Yeah.
yeah, well, you should definitely meet because I think you have a lot of the same experience. And she also evolved in a world of men and is also now a very good golf player because that was kind of the passage obligé. So I had a question for you, which might be a bit naive, but so you say you serve on 85 board, which by the way is amazing. I don't think I've ever heard that. But so a lot of them were hospital boards, and
No, no, they were not.
they were not
No, I hardly ever served on a hospital board because I ran
okay.
a hospital. I had my own board. But I served on, in fact, I'm not even sure I counted all the boards that I actually was on because of my job. I It was all about being in the community. So, Red Cross board, United Way board. I've served on three university boards, Duke and Michigan State University and Franklin University in Columbus, Ohio. I've served on healthcare leadership boards like the American Hospital Association, group purchasing organizations for healthcare called Premier. I've served on a ton of different types of boards, and that's what I've enjoyed the most. I've learned so much about a variety of things, and I've learned a lot about governance. I know good governance, very clearly because I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of governance. And, you really learn a lot from those experiences.
I love that. And now that I know you and I know you're intentional, there's definitely a philanthropic aspect, but did you also feel that getting engaged in the community was a good business decision?
I thought it was essential for a healthcare organization because, when you think about hospitals and how they started in communities, they were created by community leaders. At Henry Ford himself created Henry Ford Hospital because his workers needed good health care. And in Detroit at that time, he didn't believe that they had a first class hospital and he wanted to create it. So when you think about community need and why you're there, it's so important to really connect with the community. In Detroit, it was so important for me to connect with very diverse communities, whether it was the Arab American community, which we have a huge population of in Detroit, the African American community. I served as general co-chair of the NAACP dinner and, became involved in that organization. The Hispanic community, the Jewish community. Every aspect becomes very important. And, for me, diversity was part of my strategic thinking when it came to every dimension of our performance. Diversity was important to our quality. It was important to our people, how we recruited and retained the best people, how we attracted patients from diverse communities. So when I became involved in the community, it just gave me such a great window into all of the people that we were serving and allowed me, I think, as a leader to be much more effective in creating the strategies that would really improve care, particularly quality and service and cultural competency and all the aspects that are very important to people.
So when I was thinking about our conversation, I had a question for you that I've been asking myself, and you might not have the answer to it. But when we had the disclosures on Nasdaq, which now unfortunately have been repealed, but for 2 years, we were able to see
Right.
where LGBT people were. And what was a bit striking was that we were doing well in healthcare and life science. And there are big names like Cassie Aligan, who's on the board of, was on the board of, I think she's on the board of Sleep Number. Sandra Hernandez was on the board of 23andMe. Like, it was pretty striking that we were doing better in healthcare and life science than in other industry. Like manufacturing, we had 0.2% of board seats, compared to
Yeah.
healthcare, which I think is 1.3%. I came with the conclusion that maybe it's because it's a little more technical. But given the fact that you live in this world, do you see a reason why LGBT people would be
Oh, yeah.
performing a bit better?
No, I think it's very logical, actually, because when you think about healthcare, we're providing care to everyone. Everyone comes through our doors, every type of person, healthcare as a field is incredibly diverse in terms of the workforce. And as a result, I think that kind of brings about more humanity, frankly, and much more focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it does not surprise me. And also, if you look at the boards of those healthcare related organizations, they tend to be more diverse earlier. If you looked at automotive, for example, I mean, until Mary Barra came along, there was hardly any, not even a woman on most of the boards, if maybe one. So I think it's quite logical. Manufacturing has been largely a male-dominated world. If you look at healthcare, it's female-dominated. 75% of our employees at Henry Ford were women. And if you looked in leadership over time, that's changed a lot as well. So it's still not, frankly, it's still pretty male dominated. The healthcare field, it's quite surprising on leadership how male dominated it is, given that so many people who work in healthcare are women. But I do think it's not a surprise to me that those areas would be the first to probably, be much more open to a much more diverse board.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you mentioned that you were on a lot of non-profit boards, and so I have a question for both non-profit boards and after that, corporate boards, which is, were you also intentional about which committee you were serving on and taking leadership on committees? or were you usually a member of the board and you didn't really decided, oh, I'm going to head NumGov or
I was not intentional about that at all. I believe that I could learn from any board experience. I try to serve on as many committees as possible to learn about them. I think now I've probably served on every type of board committee there is, whether it's Nom and Gov or it's audit or comp or quality committees, for manufacturing companies. Even in healthcare quality committees. I just, I wanted to help the board. That was my goal. I didn't have to chair everything. I had a day job that was so demanding that I didn't need to chair everything. And I ended up chairing a lot, but it was not my goal in life to do those things. It was much more about learning and participating and networking and meeting great people from those board experiences.
so you just joined a very prestigious board, which is a healthcare related board. But do you feel that at this point it doesn't have to be healthcare, meaning that you could work in be on a board for distribution or be in a board of a completely unrelated
Well,
type of company?
Baxter is a manufacturing company.
Okay.
Um, and
Okay,
also,
sorry about that. So
yeah, and
Walgreens has a healthcare component, but Baxter is
well,
manufacturing.
but it's healthcare. I mean, it produces supplies for hospitals.
Yeah.
It has 70% of the market for IV solutions, as an
Okay.
example. It is the biggest business for home dialysis in the world. So I mean, I'm on a variety of boards, which is what I love. I mean, Walgreens is a retail pharmacy company by and large. I mean, they've gotten into healthcare, but that's been very challenging. Baxter is manufacturing, and Compass Health is a hospital-based company in rehabilitation medicine. And I've been on Hillrom, which was a manufacturing company built, making hospital beds and all kinds of equipment for physician offices. So I mean, it's a variety of things, and that's what I like. I mean, I've learned a ton about supply chain, about manufacturing processes, and some of the issues from a quality perspective that are so critical, and the regulatory environment, frankly, too, that they deal with.
And at this point of your board career, do you feel you still have to be a little bit out there, or it's really at this point it's search firms are just going to approach you, or boards are going to express interest, or do you still make the effort of being like, well, I'm here, I'm available,
To
I'm
be honest,
business.
I have never made that effort in my life. It's the weirdest thing. I have never been a self promoter. The only thing I've done that probably has helped me over the years is I always answer every search firm's calls. And the reason I do that, even when they're calling me for, a healthcare leadership role, I always give them ideas. I give them recommendations. Most of the time I say I'm not interested, but I give them, some suggestions for people. And I think they appreciate that. So they tend to keep me in mind. Um, but I grew up without social media. I grew up with, very little in terms of this notion that you self promote. I am on LinkedIn, which is a rare thing for me. Um, but I still get calls. I got a call, within the last week for another board opportunity, which I turned down. Um, but I'm 70 years old now. So I mean, I've only got about 5 more years of tenure on my public boards. And so I'm at a good point. I'm doing other things as well, thinking about another book. And keeping busy with my golf, and so I'm enjoying life. Let's just put it that way. I'm very fortunate.
Well, I mean, there's two things that are really interesting for me. One thing is that well, that's a very good tip for the people that are listening to us, which is always respond to recruiter calls, even if you're not interested in the job. And then the second aspect is that, you kind of, in a way, make the case for the association, which is the idea that it's not bad if LGBT people know other LGBT people, if straight people know LGBT people that are in the board, because they are more likely to say, "Oh, well, I'm not interested, but you should reach out to that person." And so the people that you recommend are typically people that you've served on board with, or that have been in your career, that you have observed in your career, I
You know,
imagine.
what my experience has been, Fabrice, is that I I focused completely on what I was doing in my career. It was all about really doing well as a healthcare leader. And what has shocked me no end throughout my career is how people find out about that. And they learn, what I've done, and then they want me to do things. They ask me to do things. Um, and so I've always told people the most important thing if you want to get on a board is be a high performer in your job. Do really well and do tough things. I've done a zillion turnarounds in my career. That's what I did. I didn't go into the garden markets. I was in Akron, Ohio and Detroit, Michigan for most of my career. That's not what people think of when it's the New York, the Chicagos, the San Franciscos of the world. I didn't live in that world. I lived in really tough markets, and I had to do things with innovation and quality and really supporting our people. And as a result, somehow people learned about me, and I have no clue how that happened. But
I love it because as a Frenchman, I came to the United States and I understood that self-promotion had to be a part of the game. But you're basically saying, well, look, this is kind of wasted time. Just perform well,
oh, sometimes
and
it
people will find
backfires.
out about you. And
Yeah,
people will find out
I mean, I
about you.
think self-promotion can really backfire. um, because I think, somebody who's too focused on themselves. I mean, leadership is not about focusing on yourself, in my view. It's about focusing on your customers and your employees and your community. And when you do that well, guess what? You perform well. I mean, it's amazing how that contributes to success.
Well, so that's great because it's a great segue to my next question, which is a difficult one, which is very often, I make the case that LGBT people, it would be best if there was better representation of LGBT people in the boardroom, and very often people say why, and say what is the benefit of an LGBT person in the boardroom. And so the natural instinct, is to respond and say, well, look, there's a demographic change in America. They can help you navigate that, right? There are more LGBT people, and having someone in the board can help you navigate that change. But really, I have a bit of a belief that sometimes being LGBT people give you a different lens around, relationship, around business, and so I have always been terrible at encompassing, at articulating this idea, right? That maybe LGBT people have a specific experience that is beneficial to business. Did you at any point feel that your experience as an LGBT people, what you describe, maybe, the isolation at Duke or having to learn to play by the playbook of the guys, right? Which is maybe more as a woman than as a lesbian. But do you feel that those things have contributed to you being what you describe, which is a good leader that is able to inspire your staff and take care of your customers?
I'm not sure those things were the things that were important for me. It was much, and it's been true as I've looked at other LGBTQ people in, my workforce, among my leadership. I think most people in our community had to be perfect to do well. And I believe that with all elements of diversity. I see it with African American leaders. I see it in so many domains of leadership. And it's why I think diverse candidate pools are essential for leadership, because you improve the candidate pool by making it diverse. You make it stronger because the people that had to succeed in that world had to be almost perfect. The other characteristic that I like a lot in our community is resilience. I grew up during the AIDS crisis as a leader. And, to watch what people had to do and what they dealt with during that time. And always being, it's easy to cast people out, and to stay in the game and to always be present and to be yourself and to be strong. Those are great qualities in an organization and great qualities for a board. Much like I think my turnaround experience is great for board work because I've been through a lot that I think adds value when tough economic times come, or, times like we're in right now that are so difficult for companies, to try to navigate. So I think, it's those personal qualities, frankly, that I think are terrific. I also think diversity around a board table, frankly, is how you become more innovative in every aspect because people, as you said, they have a different lens on it. They see the world a little differently. And I think that's a fantastic aspect, for leadership.
Oh, I love I love the 3 points, but I also particularly love the one about perfection because I do, it's not really my world, right? I was never in business. I'm a public servant, but I have been around LGBT directors a lot lately because of that association, and what strikes me, without wanting to be rude, is that a lot of them are type A overachiever, and I
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of joke that they will read the board packet from beginning to end because
It's so true.
they are the type of people they are. But I think there is a bit of a counter aspect to that, which is there's also a lot of them have made gigantic sacrifice in their personal life to 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 be at the top of their business. You know,
But
do you?
that's true. That's true of straight people too.
Yeah, that might be
I
true.
mean,
You're right.
if you really
I
look,
just know
if you
them.
really look at people in top leadership, all of them
Yeah.
have made substantial sacrifice, sometimes at great loss, in their lives.
But sometimes the people you see in the boardroom, they are not as dedicated as the LGBT board member. I
Oh,
joke,
that is true.
I had a friend that told me that I think he worked for a fund, and he would tell me board member would come and they would not have read the board packet and they would not have any question because they just like where I am God give to earth. I don't have to prove anything to anybody. I
Yeah,
don't
you
need
can
to
see
read
some
the
of
board
that for
packet.
sure.
I love that, and the resilience aspect that's also to me very striking what you said, because it's true that you always think about being on the board of a company that is doing very well, but sometimes companies have difficult times, right? And having someone on the board that is able to navigate those difficult times, whether it's COVID, right? We saw it a lot with
Right,
COVID,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, and you really saw it during COVID. I was co-chairing a council in Michigan that Jim Fitterling was serving on with me, and I so admired him in his approach during COVID, and I didn't really know him uh, at all, but watching how different leaders navigated, you could see his great strengths during that time.
Yeah, and you could imagine that in the case of Jim, he had this cancer right at some point, and he had the experience of being in the closet for most of his life, and all of those things probably kind of
Yep.
inform you that you can survive crises, and well, I love that. I would love to ask anybody that is in the audience if they have any question for Nancy. I would be super happy to relay it. Um, but my next question to you is, do you have advice for LGBT people that maybe are at the beginning of their board career or are thinking about board service? I mean, one of the things that is a clear takeaway from me is what you said about, nurture those relationship with recruiters, right? And be careful about being responsive. But do you have any others? Is there anything else that comes to mind for
Yeah,
you in?
there are a couple things. One is, build your network throughout your career and build it in, different ways. It's not just to stay in your lane for in your professional life, but it's getting out of your lane, meeting people that might diversify your network, people that, might think of you for, a local board opportunity. And I do think there's huge value in any governance experience. I am not one of these people that kind of downplays the importance of nonprofit boards. I think they're vitally important, and I think often they're dealing with incredible complexity, often more complexity than some of the corporate boards I've been on. It's quite interesting. If you think of a university or a health system board, these are unbelievably complex organizations that, are big in terms of size. Many of them, multi-billion dollar organizations with huge financial risk. And learning about those organizations and serving on their boards, I think can broaden your thinking around board work substantially and be of great value to a public board, a corporate board.
You mentioned that you served on three different university boards. So Duke is your alma mater, but how did the other two
Yeah.
board came to be?
The Franklin University is a business school based in Columbus, Ohio, and they asked me to be on the board because I was CEO of the major local hospital. But it was a great experience. I really enjoyed it, and it taught me a lot about the university as a business because I really had no concept of that. And then Michigan State, I was actually appointed by Governor Rick Snyder when he was in office. And it was in the midst of the crisis around Nassar and the sexual abuse of all the gymnasts. And that occurred, many of the victims were from Michigan State. So it was a very challenging time. I only stayed on that board for 2 years, and I actually resigned because they would not do a thorough investigation of what happened. And I had really stood up strongly that I felt that was critically needed in order to address the issue and also be able to move from it. But they had never really resolved it in the eyes of their faculty, their students, the survivors, the victims of the abuse. And so that was a difficult situation, and it was very public in Michigan when that happened. Um, but again, I learned a lot about governance, learned a lot about different models of governance because those state universities in Michigan have publicly elected board members that come from the political parties. So it's a very odd governance structure, one that frankly I wouldn't recommend. And I think they end up without the quality of board member, the experience of board members, and they end up with people that become too political in that environment as opposed to really,
Because they are
yeah,
named instead
exactly.
of
And
being.
they're on the ballot in the general election. It's just bizarre.
You know,
And
I'm a bit interested by the idea of dissent in the boardroom. Are there other boards that you've resigned of because you felt that that they were not aligned with your views, or
not really. I've resigned for other reasons, sometimes just workload. I resigned from the American Board of Surgery. I was on the American Board of Surgery as the only non-surgeon. And it was a wonderful board, but the workload was so high at the time. And I thought, I cannot do this, in good faith and do a good job. And, so I resigned
those
after.
are not remunerated boards, right?
No, 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 there was no payment at all. And
A lot of work
yeah, it
and
was
no.
a ton of work. And I decided at that point, because I had retired, that this was a little too much for me. But I loved the people. I was so impressed with what the surgeons did from a leadership standpoint. They were remarkable. But it was just not quite my thing.
Um, well, I love it. I mean, all of this conversation is fascinating, and I love the opportunity to meet you, and I'm so happy our members can discover your journey. My last question to you is, well, as you can imagine, we are a little bit in a moving context because now there are no more disclosure, around with LGBT in the boardroom, and frankly, board diversity is a little bit maybe temporarily on its back heel, meaning,
Yeah.
that's not the priority of the board at this point. And do you have any thoughts on how, as a community, we can take some steps to improve a bit our representation in the boardroom? By which I mean, that other
Yeah.
groups are doing similar efforts, and I would
Well,
love
first
to
of all,
hear.
just a comment, based on my exposure in the boardroom, while people are taking away, words that tend to be a little problematic right now, they aren't really reducing their commitment to diversity in their companies. Actually, they want diverse boards. I don't think that has really changed. But I do think one of the things that would be great would be to hold up great leaders in the LGBT community, people who are accomplishing great things, who would be exceptional board members, almost in a development standpoint. Where are those great leaders out there that we should be keeping an eye on? And, trying to create a pipeline, frankly, of talent for boards to consider and to be helpful in almost in a search-like way. You become a search firm for potential board members that would be great for a lot of boards to take a look at.
No, I love that because our experience too has been, we felt we knew who were the LGBT people at the top of business, and then you start traveling, and you realize that there is, a
A lot more.
lesbian that is, in tech in Atlanta that is amazing and that is not on your radar screen because of exactly what you described, which is a lot of those people are so focused on their job
Right.
that they don't really have the time to be, out there trying to be noticed as a business leader. So
And those are exactly the ones we would want to know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. And, it's pretty amazing to see, we just did a dinner in Detroit, right? And we are going to do a dinner in Austin. And you always meet fascinating people
Yeah.
that are not vacationing in Provincetown, right? And that are just, doing their thing in their city, right? And you're right, are not on the radar screen of recruiters, and we can do better.
Yep.
Um, well, look, Nancy, I'm extremely grateful you took the time. It means a lot to me. Your story is fascinating. Now I have to read that book
I
about
appreciate it.
your 1997 experience, which sounds pretty horrendous.
It's also about my time in Detroit. So it's not just about that. It
Okay.
details that, but it's really about my journey in and what you're able to do, I think, by paying attention to people, by paying attention to diversity and focusing on quality and really, being a humane leader, I think is the key.
Well, I love it, and thank you so much for your time. I hope we have the
My
opportunity
pleasure.
at some
Thank you
point
so
to meet
much for the
to meet
invitation.
in
It's been
person.
great.
And have a good afternoon. See you
Thank
soon.
you. You
Bye
too.
bye.